There are two speakers as well as me. We have Professor Masamichi Hasebe from Kobe in Japan and Dr. Jeffrey Hardy in London. And I'll just briefly introduce the two of them before we start. Professor Masamichi Hasebe is professor in the Marine Science Faculty of Kobe University. He's worked for several different Japanese government ministries, and he's also worked for the OECD as well as Daiwa Institute of Research. And he focuses these days on climate-related or global warming issues and is active as a lecturer in Japan. And then our second speaker will be Dr. Jeffrey Hardy. He is a senior research fellow at the Grantham Institute at Imperial London, where he leads a team examining policy and regulation of smart local energy systems. And Dr. Hardy has wide experience in positions relating to sustainable energy and the UK's energy policy. He was previously head of sustainable energy futures at Ofgem, the regulator. He was also head of science for one of the work groups of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And among other things, he's also worked as a research chemist at Sellafield in a nuclear laboratory. So we're going to run on, I think, a little bit after 1 o'clock today, depending on how lively the questions are. But without further ado, I will hand over to Professor Hasebe.
Thank you. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Masamichi Hasebe, professor of Kobe University in Japan. At first, I'd like to express my sincere appreciation to the Daiwa Anglo-Japanese Foundation and its Director General, Dr. Jason James. It is my great honor and privilege to speak to distinguished audience in the UK, Japan, and other countries in the world at a prestigious webinar and facilitate your understanding about Japanese policy and strategy of net zero by 2050. So today I would like to speak about climate change, energy transfer, renewable energy, and the new energy strategy in Japan. As regards the existing situation of the climate, according to the most up-to-date report by WMO, concentration of GHG continued to rise. Temperature in 2020 was one of the 3 warmest years on the record, and the trend in sea level rise is also accelerating. And Arctic, Antarctic, and North Atlantic hurricane, all of those factors are getting worse. So this is the state of the global climate in 2020. And this is a prospect in future. So as far as the global surface temperature, there are several scenarios made by IPCC, but according to the average scenario, the global surface temperature will increase 2.7 degrees compared to the pre-industrial level. This is a September Arctic sea ice area. Again, according to the standard scenario, around 2070, Arctic will become a practically ice-free situation. And then this is a global ocean surface pH concerning ocean acidification. So again, by the end of the century, ocean acidification will be worsening. And then global mean sea level change relative to 1900. So according to almost all scenarios, the global mean sea level will increase between 0.5 to 1 meter by the end of this century. So we need to energy transfer. So what is energy transfer? We need to stop or decrease fossil fuels. And at first, we need to scrap existing coal power plants and stop investments in new coal power plants, both in domestically and both in developing countries. Then we need to promote electrification, like electronic vehicles and office home heating by electricity and so on. And then lastly, we need to promote renewable electricity by onshore, offshore, floating wind power, and solar power. This is a chart of the trends in the top 5 coal-consuming countries. As you see that China is the largest coal-consuming countries, but it has already downwards, but still keeps a very high level of the consumption. And the United States gradually decreasing the amount, but on the contrary, India still increasing the amount of the consuming coal. And Germany and Russia keep the same level. So concerning the national gas, there is discussions about natural gas. As far as I know, that the Western European countries regard that the natural gas as a fossil fuel, so they don't want to keep natural gas as a transitional fuel. But on the contrary, Eastern European countries want to keep natural gas as an option, as a means of the transitional fuel from coal power plant. Japan itself, still wants to increase the import of the LNG, liquefied national gas, because now at this moment we stopped the operation of the nuclear power, so we need to keep as much as option of the energy sources. However, World Bank strongly recommends the government, as far as maritime transport bunkers, fuels, they recommended the government to stop the investment for the LNG bunker supplement infrastructure, because LNG cannot be regarded as a sustainable fuel for the maritime transport in future. So renewable energy. As regards the existing renewable electricity capacity, China has the largest capacity, 895 gigawatt, followed by United States, 292 gigawatt. The difference between China and the United States will continue to expand. So in 2020, in EU, share of renewable electricity has already surpassed the share of the fossil electricity. In the same year in the UK, also the share of the renewable electricity has surpassed the share of fossil electricity. As a result, in 2025, renewable energy will become the largest energy source, supplying 1/3 of total world energy. So how about the cost? Traditionally, most of people think that the renewable energy is much expensive than traditional energy, but the cost of the renewable energy continue to fall. As a result, for example, in 2019, 62% of new added capacity of renewable energy had lower costs than the cheapest, most effective new fossil fuel-fired plant. So now, majority of renewable energy is cheaper than fossil fuel. As a result, in 2021, 800 gigawatts of existing coal plants cost more compared to the new solar power and onshore wind projects. So let's move to Japan. Japanese former Prime Minister declared carbon neutral by 2050 in October 2020. And he also expressed the midterm target of a 46% GHG reduction by 2030 in April this year. Accordingly, the Japanese government officials drafted and proposed the sixth strategic energy plan. According to this proposed plan, we will reduce the total primary energy generation from 478 COE to 430 billion COE by improving energy efficiency and energy conservation. And we will increase the use of renewables. The share of the renewables in power generation shall be increased from 80% in 2018 to 38% by 2030. Accordingly, we will reduce reliance on petroleum and coal. So as far as the electricity production sector, at first we will improve the energy efficiency and then introduce sustainable energy like solar and wind. And as far as the non-electricity sector, again that we will at first improve the energy efficiency, and also as much as possible we would like to electrify the energy of the non-electricity sector. And then remaining part, we will introduce the alternative fuels like natural gas, hydrogen, biomass. And as far as new technology, carbon capture and storage will become cost-effective, market feasible, economic feasible. We will also utilize CCS technology for the emission from the power plant, and also even from the atmosphere called negative emissions. This is the upper figure is a figure in 2018. So at that time, we relied on the LNG 38%, coal 32%. So in total, as a fossil fuel, we relied on fossil fuel 77%. But according to the existing strategic plan, still at the time of the 2030, majority energy relied on the fossil fuels, and renewables and nuclear power will share nearly the same share, around 22%. This is a table comparison of the existing strategic energy plan and proposed new strategic energy plan. In this table, nuclear power is classified in the zero-emission power sources. But there is a discussion, even in European countries, as far as I know, that, for example, Germany has already abandoned nuclear power. But for example, France still puts a priority on the nuclear power plant. And also your country, the United Kingdom, because the United Kingdom, your government put importance on the zero emission. So your government want to utilize the nuclear power. So in Japan, as far as industries people and government officials also want to keep nuclear power and even want to increase the share of the nuclear power, because as a result of the tragic incident in Japan, that at this moment nearly all of the nuclear power plant has been shut down, so they want to reoperate the nuclear power. So according to the new strategic plan, so eventually the zero emission power sources will have a majority share, around 60%, and then fossil fuel have a 41%. However, for example, as far as the coal power plant is concerned, as far as I know, that almost all Western European countries have expressed that they will stop the operation of the coal power plant by 2030 at the latest. So compared to the European countries, even according to the new ambitious strategic energy plan, Japan still wants to keep coal power station around 20%. So it's a big difference between Japan and the Western developed countries. This is a comparison between the existing plan and the new plan concerning the targets of the renewable energy generation. The main source of the renewable energy in Japan is solar. And fortunately, we traditionally have the traditional sources of hydropower. So we will, in future, expand that offshore wind and onshore wind, but we have the some restriction of the space. So to conclude, while the former Prime Minister declared a 2050 carbon neutral policy, however, most government officials and industries are not yet convinced that the target is achievable. Accordingly, there is no concrete plan for achieving even the midterm objective of a 40% reduction by 2030. And there are some groups of people who want just to utilize decarbonization as an excuse for redeveloping nuclear power plants. As Japan has been lucky enough to be a beautiful country without a significant spending, the large part of Japanese people don't have strong concerns about or interest in climate, environmental issues. Accordingly, they tend to be reluctant to invest in decarbonization, which they still believe is costly and negative for economic development. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you very much indeed, Hasebe Sensei. I'll just pass straight on now to Dr. Jeffrey Hardy.
Perfect. All right, let me get my slides shared. Whilst I do that, I just want to thank Professor Hasabi for an excellent presentation. One of the things that I find really interesting is that statistic about the environmental preference of Japanese people. In recent teaching, I've been using some research from the Pew Center for research, which shows that in quite a lot of countries at the moment, environment is ranking still as high a concern as dealing with the COVID pandemic, despite the pandemic, which you'd expect to really kind of like be front and center on people's minds. So it's fascinating to me, kind of like how attitudes towards zero carbon and so forth change from country to country. Although I do agree that Japan is particularly beautiful. So thank you to the foundation for the opportunity to speak today. I'm going to talk about the UK route map to net zero greenhouse gas emissions. So Professor Hasabi has already given all of the important evidence about why we need a net zero transition. So I'm just going to put some detail on what's happening in the UK. So a little context first. So let's have some UK statistics here. So we are a country of around 66 million people, and the UK is 4 countries. So it's England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. At the moment, the energy use per person in the UK is something like about 25 megawatt hours per year. As Professor Hasabi has already said, we have about 42% of our electricity that comes from renewables at the moment, although this year has been slightly lower in terms of output. It's been a funny year, as most of us know, in terms of current energy prices. We have about just over half a vehicle per home or per person in the UK, and most of our heating in our homes is from gas. So that's 86% of our homes are heated by gas at the moment. Now, on going forward to when we have a zero carbon target, there's a few things that are going to change in the UK. So the population is going to go up by about 11 million people or so. We don't know exactly at the moment how much energy is going to be used per person in the UK, although I would expect it to be lower, and I'll come on to that later. Around about 80% of our electricity is going to come from renewables. Majority of that is going to be offshore wind. We're going to have slightly less vehicles per person, but most of those vehicles are going to be battery electric vehicles. And our home is going to transition, heating in homes is going to transition from gas to a mixture of electricity through heat pumps and so forth, and heat networks, and potentially hydrogen in some places. And that's got about, where are we at now? About 29 years to sort that out, give or take. So lots of things to do. So all of this net zero all of our action on net zero has been driven by the UK Climate Change Act. So we had a Climate Change Act prior to 2019, from 2008, which was an 80% target. So it was like the UK emissions are going to be 80% lower than a 1990 baseline by 2050. Well, that was updated in 2019 off the basis of the science and off the basis of the Paris Agreement to become a zero carbon target. So now our target is that by 2050, our emissions will be at least 100% lower than the 1990 baseline. And that at least is important because that gives the opportunity for going further, taking emissions out of the atmosphere. So the way in which we do the strategy for achieving net zero is we have an organization independent of government called the Climate Change Committee, which makes recommendations on carbon budgets. And it does these with 15 years foresight, and it does them in 5-year tranches. So in this graph, we have at the bottom here, the carbon budgets from 2008 all the way through to 2038 at the moment. So the latest one, Carbon Budget 6, is the first carbon budget which brought in the zero carbon target. And you can see a big drop off between the 5th carbon budget and the 6th carbon budget. So in real terms, that 6th carbon budget, which is by 2038, is a 78% reduction in our emissions compared to 1990. So more than 3/4 of the emissions of the whole UK economy gone, reduced, removed. So it's a really big target. The other thing that the Climate Change Committee gives is advice across the whole economy. You know, what is required in order to hit those targets? And I just put this slide in. I don't want you to focus on the detail. What I want you to focus is on what it means, really. And what this slide means is across all of those sectors, which are on the left-hand side, there is an awful lot of action required between now and 2050. So, for example, you decarbonize the whole of the electricity system, and you develop hydrogen, and you sort out the energy efficiency in buildings and then go for widespread electrification. You sort out your entire road transport fleet and turn over all of those vehicles to zero carbon alternatives. You work on your industrial clusters with deployment of carbon capture and storage. You also think about land use. You also think about agriculture. And the big change from having an 80% carbon reduction target to having a 100% target is in an 80% target, some of these options where you can do this or this. With a 100% target, you have to do all of it at the same time and probably faster than you had in an 80% target. So it's a lot of effort. The other side of the advice from the Climate Change Committee is that technology alone doesn't do everything. So this graph basically shows that around 30% of the carbon savings are basically technology switches. You know, so you switch from a fossil fuel vehicle to an electric vehicle, for example, and that changes the carbon emissions. However, that means that about over 60% of the measures are some sort of combination of technology and behavioral change, or around 9% of the measures are entirely behavioral change driven. So that could be changing diet, or changing how often you fly, or changing whether you own a car. Those kind of really big behavioral changes. So I don't want to give the impression there's a big technology fix in all of this. There is a marriage of technology and behavior change that's required to get to zero carbon. So off the back of the latest Climate Change Committee guidance, the government came out with a 10-point plan for a green industrial revolution. So this is the UK government. And that involves some very big aspirations on things like offshore wind, so 40 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030, hydrogen, up to 5 gigawatts of hydrogen capacity by 2030, more investments in large and small advanced modular reactors for nuclear power, lots of effort on electric vehicles, including battery factories, etc., investment into public transport, including zero carbon alternatives, further research and development into aviation and shipping, lots of effort on building standards and building performance to drive down the energy usage in building by increasing their efficiency, more work on carbon capture and storage, 30% of UK land through new national parks, improve 30% of UK land, so lots of work on land use and land change, and then also finance and innovation, so kind of like driving the investment to feed all of these activities. So lots to do in that, and those measures alone do not take us to zero carbon. They are a plan to get going by 2030. So let me just bring it back to the energy context in the UK. So in the UK, 83% of our energy across energy supply, transport, and energy use in homes and buildings is responsible for 83% of UK's greenhouse gas emissions. So that tells you that there's an awful lot of fossil fuels remaining in our energy system in the UK. And on the right-hand side of this slide, I've given a quick, if you like, a red, amber, green status on where we're at. So on electricity, we're broadly on track to decarbonise. On transport, we know where we're going. And on heat, we still don't really have a firm plan. We know what's needed, but we don't know how we're going to do it. So I'm going to break those down really quickly. So on electricity, on the right-hand side of this slide is what needs to happen to the carbon intensity of electricity generation in the UK. And you can see that by 2035, we're going to take virtually all of the carbon out of electricity supply. And the reason why you do that is because then you can use electricity in other sectors to drive decarbonisation. So you can move transport across to electric vehicles, you can move some heating across to electric heating. And then on the left-hand side of this slide, it's about the contribution by sectors to increased electricity demand. So it's the other side of that story. And you can see that surface transport is going to drive greater demand for electricity. Buildings are going to drive more demand for electricity because of heating changes. Same with non-residential buildings, same with some manufacturing and construction processes, same with some fuel supply processes. So you can see that you're shifting sectors to zero carbon electricity away from fossil fuels. That's the story. And then in terms of what the mix looks like, we don't know exactly what the mix of technologies is going to be, but we do know that electricity is going to be predominantly delivered by variable renewables. There's going to be an awful lot of offshore wind in there. But there's also going to be other technologies like onshore wind, solar photovoltaic, even in the UK, which isn't that sunny, as well as things like biomass for electricity generation. There's also quite a lot of electricity for hydrogen production. So that's green hydrogen, so electrolysis of water. There's also a requirement for some firm power, which is not entirely clear what that might be. But obviously it needs to have very little or limited carbon emissions. So it could be technologies with carbon capture and storage and so forth, or it could be nuclear power, for example. And then there's dispatchable low carbon generation. So that flexibility in the system, which could be a mix of all sorts of things, but again, without the carbon emissions. So it could be zero carbon gases, it could be carbon capture and storage, it could be batteries, etc. in there. On transport, things are relatively clear in the UK. This is just a breakdown of the UK surface transport emissions, and really what it's telling you is cars and vans and heavy goods vehicles are the majority of the current UK carbon emissions from transport. So that tells you where your priorities need to be. And what the pathways for success are going forwards are really to change all cars over to zero emission vehicles for those cars that remain, and ditto with other important vehicles like HGVs and vans. So for cars and vans, it's typically an electrification pathway. We know that the cost of batteries is coming down. We know that people actually really quite like electric vehicles. So we can see a very clear pathway to that. And the government's very confident because they basically put a target for a ban on fossil fuel cars at 2035. So no fossil fuel cars, no hybrids by that point. And all fossil fuel vehicles, just pure fossil fuel vehicles, are banned from 2030 as well. So you can see that the government is confident in getting cars electrified. Similar with vans, HGVs, heavy goods vehicles, a little bit more difficult because they don't always suit electric vehicles. There might be other options in there like zero carbon gases, such as hydrogen or biogases and so forth as alternatives in there. There's also clearly a need for efficiency in here, reducing demand from vehicles, both from not driving, but also from energy efficiency improvements of the vehicles themselves. And this is just an illustrative idea about what that means in terms of the rate of vehicles being kind of changed. So you can see here that by 2035, so the end of the middle of the sixth carbon budget, we're expecting something like 25 to 28 million electric vehicles and plug-in hybrids on the UK roads, give or take, which is a very significant proportion of the vehicles on the roads already. And then in support of that, then there is a need for a public charging infrastructure for those electric vehicles. And you can see that it's a mixture of slow chargers all the way up to very rapid chargers, 150 kilowatt hour plus chargers. So there's things are going to have to move incredibly quickly in transport. And then finally on heat, this is a little snapshot, if you like, of the UK problem in this space. So we have, as I said earlier, about 86% of homes are on gas heating, and then a substantial amount more on top of that are on oil-based heating. So about 90% of homes are on some sort of fossil fuel heating. In terms of suitability for zero carbon alternatives, then there's a number of homes, nearly about 20% suitable for district heating, and then a very large chunk which is suitable for air source heat pumps. Others might require either a zero carbon gas or an alternative. You know, in some new buildings, you shouldn't really need much heat at all. This is how the UK building stock's energy efficiency is rated. So A is good and G is bad. And you could see that a very large chunk of the UK building stock is quite bad in terms of energy efficiency. And that's a real problem. So whatever happens has to come with a large retrofit to improve energy efficiency of buildings. And then there is also a 10-year issue in the UK. So we have a lot of homes that are owner occupied. So people live in the home they own, but also we have a substantial proportion that are either social housing or private rented housing. And therefore there is often a split incentive between the landlord of those properties and the tenant on, say, zero carbon heating or energy retrofit, because the landlord pays for it and the tenant benefits, but they don't necessarily see a way to recuperate the costs of the measures. We also have a fuel poverty issue in the UK, which is getting rapidly worse because of the high gas prices. And we have a very low awareness about zero carbon and heating in the UK. So that's a lot of contextual things which are really important for how the UK goes forward. In terms of what happens in the UK, then this graph is really the kind of like the measures that get you to zero carbon. And you can see in the sort of like the dark green or the teal color here, changing heating is a massive component of that, but it's not the only component of taking emissions out of heating. There is also behavior change, there is also cooking, there is also building energy efficiency. So it's a real suite of measures that are required to take the carbon emissions out of heating in the UK. And much of it is predicated upon taking all of the carbon emissions out of electricity as well. And then it's just to give you an indication of the kind of like the pace of change. Again, you're looking at millions of interventions across homes. So there's something like about 29 million homes in the UK. Then you can see that there's so many measures that are going to have to be adopted, at a frightening rate. So the government's 10-point plan commits to something like about 600,000 heat pumps a year being deployed by 2030. But actually, the Committee on Climate, or the Climate Change Committee's modelling says it needs to be closer to 1 million a year by 2030. and an equivalent retrofit program going alongside that. And one of the things that this comes through into is a skills gap, if you like. So what the modeling shows in terms of delivering all of that heat and energy efficiency measures is we're going to need about 250,000 more trained and skilled fitters and other skilled workers to deliver on that. So, you know, it's not a strategy that sits in isolation to say, let's just have 600,000 heat pumps. You also need the trained people, you need the trust in the supply chain, etc. So there's an awful lot of other things that need to come alongside this heating transformation. So I'm going to leave, I've got 2 more slides, then I'm going to finish. This first slide is about coming back to the supply chain. So what we have really is a rate at which we need to change things in the UK. So in terms of renewable energy, we need to be deploying about 3.6 gigawatts a year of new renewable capacity. In terms of battery electric vehicles, then we need to be putting about 1.2 million battery electric vehicles on the road every year for the next 30 years or so, or 136 per hour. And in terms of heat pumps, just heat pumps, to get to that 600,000 installations a year, or 68 per hour, we're gonna need to hit that 600,000 installations a year, or 68 per hour. Now, in green below is what the supply chain currently delivers. So actually, in renewable electricity, we've been doing better than that, what we need to do, for a decade. So the UK is in a really good place. We know what we're doing on electricity and deploying renewables. We've done a fantastic job on offshore wind. In terms of vehicles, we actually replace about double the amount of vehicles per hour in the UK. But at the moment, the majority are fossil fuel for fossil fuel. Although I think the Tesla Model 3 is now the fastest selling car in the UK. Then in terms of heating, we currently replace about 182 boilers per hour in the UK, but they are almost exclusively a gas boiler for a gas boiler. And in fact, I just had to replace my gas boiler yesterday because it died on me, which I'm really annoyed about because I was going to get a heat pump next year. And then the final thing I want to talk about is that mostly when people talk about this massive transformation to get to zero carbon, we describe it as a cost. You know, it's going to cost X billion pounds per year, or X billion dollars per year, or X billion yen per year. But really, it's also a massive opportunity. So if you're in the energy supply chain, say you're a UK electricity utility, then there is quite a lot of value for you to go after. So if you can take your customers through a zero carbon journey, then there is potentially quite a lot of value for you to chase down and have a very viable business model going forwards. I'm not going to take you through all of the stuff on this slide, but we did a little bit of work on something called value pools, which is like new value opportunities for electricity utilities. And we found that there's up to about 21 billion pounds of new value available to electricity utilities on top of their usual business. So it's new value to those companies. So there is a real opportunity for businesses that are quite centered around their customers and are prepared to take customers on a zero carbon journey and bear some of the risks for those customers. There's an upside to doing that. But it's going to be, you know, very data driven. It's going to be very customer centered. But there is an opportunity there. So I'm going to stop there because I'm dying to hear your questions. But thank you all for listening, and thank you again for the opportunity to speak today.